This is Joseph Drust, and welcome to Z Classroom. This tutorial will cover various ZBrush functions to create a bladed weapon. Swords and knives are often created to accessorize models. Using ZBrush, these weapons can be easily created for use as props for character models, conceptual artwork, or even used with 3D printing for cosplay or product design. As an example, here are a few completed knives. These were all created inside of ZBrush using features such as the ZModeler Brush, Gizmo 3D, Live Boolean, Dynamesh, and even surface noise. This tutorial will cover the process used to create one of these bladed weapons. So to start off, I just have ZBrush launched, and we should have Lightbox open here on the top of my screen. And we want to make sure in the project folder here, and then we want to locate the primitives.zpr file. So after I've located this project file here in Lightbox, I'm just going to double click it to load it in. And after this loads in, it should now look like this on our screen. So this project file contains multiple tools. If I navigate to the tool palette over here, you can see there are multiple tools now loaded in. So I want to come over here and I want to select this Polymesh 3D star here. So I'm just going to click that, and that will now become the active tool in our scene. With this Polymesh 3D star selected, we can now convert this to a simple box primitive, or a Q cube. So I'm going to navigate to the tool palette again. I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom here to the Initialize tab, and then open that up. And then in here, you can see you have different options that will allow you to create simple geometry primitives. So I want to create a Q cube, and I want to set the X, Y, and Z resolutions to 1. So I'm first going to go to the X resolution here and go to 1, Y resolution 1, and Z resolution 1. And then now I'm going to click Q cube. Now when you click this Q cube button, it's going to take the model that you have selected, or the tool you have selected, and convert it to a quick cube. So clicking this button here will now transform that Polymesh 3D star into this box primitive. Now if I turn my polyframes on over here, I'll be able to see the edges on the model here, and also the poly grouping. So you can see as I have this simple cube primitive here, it has different colors displayed on all the sides. Now the poly grouping inside of ZBrush will allow you to select different parts of your model easily. So by establishing different colors or different polygroups on your mesh, you can now use these polygroups to isolate different parts of your models quickly. So with this Q cube here, I now just want to extend it out a little bit more. So I'm going to rotate to the side like this, and then I'm going to hold down Alt and drag off on a blank spot on my canvas just to zoom out a little bit here. And then I'm going to come up to the top here and disable perspective. So now I have my cube here, and my grid line is on the bottom of the floor here, and I'm looking like this. So you'll notice that I have this blue line here that is going to the right of the screen. So this is just the forward direction of the model here. Another way you can check for the position of your model in the world is to simply go to the tool palette here and click the demo head here. The demo head always faces forward in the ZBrush world. So I can just come over here and quickly select this, and now see that the demo head is facing this direction. So if I go back to my cube here, you can see that this is now corresponding to that front face. So you can use the demo head inside your scenes just to quickly determine which way your models are facing, so you're working on the correct axis. So just having the demo head in the tool palette over here, I can now quickly come through and select different primitives and then just see which way they're facing in the world. So I know that this is now the front of this cube. So now I want to just extend this cube out. And what I'm going to create first is the blade of the weapon. So I just want to take this cube and I want to just elongate it a little bit. So to elongate this quick, I'm just going to switch to the Gizmo 3D. So I'm going to make sure I'm still in edit mode at the top here. And now I'm just going to click the move button up here. You can also press the hotkey of W on your keyboard. Now after you click this, you'll be given the Gizmo 3D. So the Gizmo 3D is a universal manipulator inside of ZBrush, and this will allow you to move, scale, and rotate your model easily inside the application. Now the Gizmo 3D is an alternate manipulator, so if you'd like to go back to the traditional transpose line, you can just come up here and click this icon here, or press Y on your keyboard, and this will now toggle you back to the transpose line. So you can use the transpose line or the Gizmo 3D at any time while you're modeling. So with the Gizmo 3D here, I just want to extend this out to make this a little bit wider in this axis here. So I'm going to hover over this blue rectangle here, and as you hover over any parts of the Gizmo 3D, down below you're going to get a description of what function will be applied when you click the gizmo. So if I hover over this blue rectangle here, you can see at the bottom it says it's going to scale Z. If I hover over this white circle, you're going to see it's going to tell me I can rotate in screen space. And if I hover over these white triangles, I can move in screen space. So at any time, if you want to find out what function will be applied when using the Gizmo 3D, simply just hover over the Gizmo 3D, and then the description will be displayed below. So I'm going to grab this Scale Z rectangle here and just simply click and drag. So I'm just going to click on it and then drag horizontally. And this is going to allow me now to scale that out. So as you can see here, I've taken that cube and now I have scaled it in that Z axis. And you can do this multiple times if you would like, so you can keep making this a little bit longer. I just want to get it scaled to about here, so I want to make sure it's still falling in this grid space. And I now should have something like this. So now the next thing I want to do with this is I want to rotate it in 45 degrees. So I'm going to use this simple box primitive here to describe the sharp edge of my blade. So I'm going to now rotate my canvas and then hold down Shift, and this will now lock into this view. So looking at the front of the model. And now I'm going to grab this rotate screen part of the Gizmo 3D here and simply click and drag, and this will now perform a rotation function. And as I'm rotating this, if you hold down Shift, this will allow you to lock into 5-degree angles. So I want to just hold down Shift and rotate this until I get to that 45-degree angle. So that's going to take the model there and rotate it in 45 degrees. So now if I release, my cube should now be looking like this. Now you'll notice as I rotated this model, the Gizmo 3D has rotated with it. So it has kept the original orientation it had in relation to that original cube. So now I just want to reset this Gizmo 3D so it is back to being in a world axis. So I'm going to come to the top here of the Gizmo 3D and I'm going to click the unlock button here, which will now unlock the Gizmo 3D. And then directly next to this, I'm going to click the reset orientation. So by unlocking the Gizmo 3D, I have now made the Gizmo 3D be separate from the mesh it's attached to. So this way I can come through and manipulate the Gizmo 3D and not affect the mesh. So with this unlocked, if I click this reset orientation, this is going to reset the Gizmo's orientation to the world. So clicking this button here, you'll notice that the Gizmo 3D is now going to be reset to the world axes. So you can see it's now going horizontal and vertically correctly. And now I can come through and lock the Gizmo back. So now I've just reset the position of the Gizmo 3D so that it is no longer set to the local axis of the original model, but is now using the world axis. So now with this using the world axis, I can come through and now select the red rectangle here for scale in the x-axis. And I can click and drag this, and I'm just going to scale the box in a little bit. And you can see as I'm doing this, I'm just adding a little more tapering to that primitive shape there. So now if I rotate, you can see I'm starting to get this very simplistic blade type effect. You can see I now have a sharp top and a sharp bottom, and then I have a little bit of thickness since I just took that cube and squashed it. So this is going to establish the simple base for the blade of this weapon. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to get out of the Gizmo 3D. So I'm going to come back up to the top here and select the draw option or press Q on my keyboard. And that will now hide the Gizmo 3D. Now the cube that I generated had no divisions in the Z-axis here, so you can see it is very simplistic. So I want to come through and I want to add some geometry to this part of the model. And to add the geometry to this model, I'm going to use the ZModeler Brush. So the ZModeler Brush is a low poly modeling toolset inside of ZBrush. So to access this, we can just go to the brush icon over here and simply click, which will open up this window here. And then we want to navigate down here to the bottom and locate the ZModeler Brush. So by clicking this here, the current brush will now be switched to the ZModeler Brush. And now if I hover over any area of my model here, you'll see I'm going to get a context sensitive option. So if I hover over an edge or a poly or a point on my model, I'm going to get a different action that I can apply. Now as you hover over any of these areas on your mesh, if you simply press spacebar, this will open up the ZModeler action menu. So if you hover over an edge and press spacebar, you're going to get the ZModeler edge action menu. If you hover over a poly and press spacebar, you're going to get the ZModeler poly action menu. And then if you hover over a point and press the spacebar, you're going to get the ZModeler point action menu. So by hovering over these different areas and pressing spacebar, you can set different options and then use these on your model. So I want to hover over one of these edges here. So I'm just going to hover over this edge here, and I'm going to press spacebar to go in the ZModeler Edge action menu. And with this, I want to insert a few edge loops across the mesh. So I'm going to make sure I have the insert option selected. And then for the target, I want to change this from single edge loop to multiple edge loops. With the multiple edge loops option selected, you'll notice that a modifier panel opens up. And in here, you can even change other values to determine how these edge loops will be applied on your mesh. Down at the bottom here, we have an option for alternate polygroup and same polygroup. So I'm going to change this to same polygroup because I want my polygroups to be consistent as I add these edges on the mesh. So after I have these all set, I can now release spacebar and go back to my model. Now I can hover over that edge again, and you'll see that it's going to display insert multiple edge loops. So if I simply click and drag, this is going to allow me to insert multiple edge loops on my mesh. So as I drag up and down, I'm going to increase the amount of edge loops that are applied to the mesh. So I want to apply just a few of these, and I want to make sure I have a middle section here. So I'm going to apply about that many, and then release, and now I have this applied to my model. So I've just come through and applied edge loops across the surface there. And this is just going to allow me to get a little more resolution and bend this mesh here a little bit to establish that blade design. So after I have this done, I now just want to establish some quick polygrouping. So as we talked about earlier, polygrouping is great for hiding different parts of your model or even applying masking on the surface. So I just want to rotate back to this horizontal position here. And now I just want to hold down Control and Shift, which is going to give me my select rectangle brush. And with this, I want to simply click and drag. And just drag this out across my model here. And I want to make sure it engulfs these top two lines here. So I want to make sure that this engulfs the top edge here and the middle edge. So something like this. When you're using this select rectangle brush, if you press spacebar on your keyboard, this will allow you to move this as well. So you can move this around and then re-manipulate it as needed until it fully engulfs the area you want to select. So after I have this set up, I now just want to release, and this will now isolate the portion that was inside of that rectangle. So now I only have this part of the model visible. So if you rotate around, you're going to see I have single-sided faces of geometry here, and it's just the top part of this mesh. So with this top part of the mesh only visible, I can now apply a new polygroup just to this part of the model, which I can then use to isolate this part out as I model the rest of the mesh. So I'm going to navigate over the tool palette over here, and I'm going to go down to the polygroups area here, and now I'm just going to click auto groups. And this is just going to apply polygrouping to any geometry islands that are visible. So as I only have one visible geometry island, I'm getting one polygroup. Another option you can do to quickly polygroup visible pieces of your mesh is simply hit Ctrl+W on your keyboard, and this will apply a polygroup to those areas on your model. Now the Ctrl+W functionality correlates to this Group Masked Clear Mask button here, which if you use masking, you can mask an area and then use it to apply polygrouping to the masked area very quickly. So if you have no masking on your model, it's just going to polygroup everything that is visible. So it's really handy just for applying polygroup to models and meshes like this. So now that I have this part of the model established with that polygroup, I can now hold Control and Shift and simply drag out on the canvas like this, so in a blank spot on my scene. Now since I only have part of my model visible, when I use this Control Shift and drag out on the canvas here, so it's going to invert the visibility that is currently on this mesh. So by just dragging this out and then releasing, this is now going to flip my visibility, and now that top part should be hidden, and now I should just have this bottom area. So I'm going to do that same process again. So I'm going to hit Ctrl+W to give this all a new polygroup here. And then I also have these end parts here, and I want to give these new polygroups as well. So I'm just going to rotate to the side again, and I'm just going to drag out with the select rectangle brush again, and just engulf those top portions there that would be visible, and I'm going to hold down the Alt key. So instead of keeping what's inside the rectangle here, if you hold down the Alt key, it will hide what is inside the rectangle. So I'm now engulfing those little edge caps here on this part of the mesh here. So holding down Alt and then releasing will now hide those. Now I should just have the bottom parts of this mesh here. So now I can hit Ctrl+W again to give that a new polygroup. And now I can return the visibility back to my entire mesh by holding Control and Shift, and then just simply clicking off the canvas. This will bring back all the mesh visibility. And now I should have that cube that now has edge loops established and also polygrouping. So now I have this set up so I can use it to model this blade. So now that I have this polygrouping established, I can now apply creasing. And you can apply creasing to your model to keep edges harsh when using dynamic subdivisions or even traditional subdivisions. So I'm going to go back to the tool palette over here. I'm going to open up the geometry tab, and then I'm going to locate the crease option right here. And inside here, we have different ways in which you can apply creasing to your mesh. Since we came through and set up these polygroups on this model here, I can use this crease polygroup button here. And this will look at the polygrouping that I established to the model here, and it will apply a crease around all the borders of those polygroups. So simply clicking crease polygroup will now crease all the borders of the polygroups. So if I zoom in here, you can see you're now going to have these dotted lines established on your mesh. And these are all the areas where the creasing happened. Now, if I turn off my floor here and just zoom in a little bit, you can see that it applied that creasing around all those polygroups. Now, the top parts of the blade here, as you'll notice on this side and this side, are the same polygroup. So if you zoom in here, you're going to notice that I did not receive any edge creasing for that top of the model there. So if I come over to my geometry tab and then open up the dynamic subdivision area here, and now click dynamic subdivision, this is going to look at the topology of my model. It's going to apply a dynamic subdivision to it. Any of those creased areas that we just set will be held, so they will be extremely harsh in those areas. But you'll notice that the top of the blade here is going to be soft because it does not have any creasing. So coming over here and activating this is now going to give me this result. So I have this smooth top along the blade there, and then these sharp sides. And in the dynamic subdivision here, you can control how many dynamic subdivisions the model has by just toggling this slider here. So this is currently being displayed with 2 dynamic subdivisions. If you increase this, you'll notice that your model is going to become smoother because it is applying more dynamic subdivisions across the surface. So for this stage here, I'm just going to keep this at 2, which will allow this to function a little bit faster than if I had it all the way set up to the maximum of, say, 7 dynamic subdivision. So just be careful when using the slider because it will increase the topology on your mesh. So I'm just going to set this back down to 2. Now for this bladed weapon, I want to make sure that these top parts are also harsh. So I have this nice harsh line here that was established by that creasing. But since my polygroups were the same on this top row here, it's not going to give me a crease line between those 2 areas. So I could go through and establish new polygrouping to both sides of this mesh here, or I can go back to the crease panel here, and I can now just set a tolerance and then crease by this tolerance. So if I come to my dynamic subdivision again and then simply just turn that off, this is what the original version of the model here looks like. Now I can go to the C tolerance here, and I can change this to something, say, 45 degrees. And this is going to look at all the edge angles on your mesh. And any angles that fall in this tolerance, when I click this crease button, it will apply a crease to those edges. So by setting this to, say, 45 and now clicking crease, you're going to notice I'm now going to get a new crease generated at the top and the bottom of this mesh. Since the angle of the surfaces here were falling in that 45 degrees. So these were very harsh angles, so it's going to find these and then apply a crease to those areas. So now I have creasing applied based on those polygroups and then also by this crease tolerance. So now I've just creased my model entirely. So now if I go back to the geometry tab and go back to the dynamic subdivision area and now activate dynamic, this is now going to apply those dynamic subdivisions again. And you're going to notice now I'm having that nice harsh edge at the top of this mesh. If you turn off polyframes here, you can see that it's very harsh all the way through the model. So that should be a good start for the blade here. So now the next thing I want to do is I want to just turn my polyframes back on, and I'm just going to locate the front of the model again. So to do this, I'm going to go back to the tool palette here. I'm just going to click the demo head, and this will allow me to quickly just find the front of the mesh. Then I go back to that blade there. So I know that this part here is the front of the blade. So this is where I want the pointy part to be for our bladed weapon. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to apply a little bit of a bend. So right now this is very straight. So I want to just take the model and give it a little bit of an arcing up type effect. So as my blade would come down, I want it to arch up a little bit. So to do this bend process, we're going to use a deformer. Now the deformers live inside the Gizmo 3D Customize area. So we will first want to make sure that our model is in edit mode. We're now going to click the Move icon here, which should now display the Gizmo 3D. If the Gizmo 3D is not displayed, make sure you have it toggled on by pressing Y on your keyboard or clicking this icon here. And with the Gizmo 3D active, you will notice there's this little gear icon here. And this will take you into the Customize menu, which will allow you to access the deformers. And by clicking this, this will open up this window. In here at the top, you'll see a bunch of dynamic primitives, and these can be used to start modeling different meshes inside of ZBrush. And directly below these, you'll have a bunch of deformers. Now, when you're using a deformer, you need to make sure that your model has no traditional subdivisions applied to it. So since we're using dynamic subdivisions, ZBrush is seeing this as a model without subdivisions applied. So this will allow us to use these deformer functionalities in here and then still view our model as it would look with higher subdivision levels. So we want to locate this bend arc option here and simply click this. And this will now enable the bend arc deformer. Now, when you're looking at the deformers, you'll notice there is a bunch of cones that have been generated on your meshes, and some deformers have more cones than others. Now, as you hover over each of these cones, you'll get a description at the bottom here that will tell you what these cones will do. So we want to make sure we're in this horizontal view here, so just rotating your model and holding Shift to lock it into a horizontal orthographic view. And then we want to locate this set of cones here. And we want to find the one that's labeled angle. So it should be this one that's pointing down here, and we want to click this and then drag. And as you click and drag this, you're going to notice it's going to perform a bend on your mesh here. So moving up and down will create a different bend across that surface. Now you'll notice that since we added those edge loops across this simple box shape here, that we're getting this nice deformation. So we're getting this nice bend in an up or down position. Now if we did not add these edge loops in here, and we just had this simple box, this deformer would not function. So we would try to apply the bend, but we wouldn't have enough topology to get that nice bend happening. So that is why we added those edge loops there before we came through and started bending our mesh. Now another thing we can do with this bend arc deformer is we can apply masking while it's active to only have this bend arc affect just a part of my model here. So I only want this part of the blade to have that bend, and I want this part to remain straight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Control on my keyboard. This is going to give me the mask pen. And then I'm just going to drag out a mask. So you want to make sure you're clicking and dragging off of your model. And then as you drag this out, you're going to get this mask box. I just want to drag this out so it's over halfway of the shape here, and then just release. And this will now apply masking to this part of the model. So now if I locate that angle cone again and simply click and drag, I'm now going to perform that bend, and you're going to see that it's only going to affect the unmasked area. So this will allow me to now generate this result on my model. So now I just have this masked part of the blade, and then the unmasked part now has this little angle. So this is going to allow me to generate a nice sharp edge that's going to terminate at a point for my knife. So I'm just going to hold Control and clear the mask on that. And so now that I'm happy with this result, I can now deactivate the gizmo or accept it. So I can come back to this Customize Gear icon here, click this, which will open up that palette again. And in here you can see I have the bend arc active, so I just want to accept this. So I'm going to click the Accept button, and this will now lock in those changes from the deformer. And now I should be brought back to just the standard Gizmo 3D, and my mesh should now look something like this. So now I just have used that bend arc deformer there just to apply a little bit of a bend to my model. So now I want to take this base mesh here that I've created, and I want to use another process inside of ZBrush to start tailoring the shape of my design. And to do this, I'm going to use the live Boolean system. Now the live Boolean system inside of ZBrush requires you to have more than one subtool in order to function. So if I navigate over to the tool palette and then open up the subtool area here, you can currently see that I only have one subtool in this file. So I just need to append in another subtool. So to do this, I'm going to go to the subtool palette. I'm going to locate the append button here. I'm going to click this, and this is going to open up this pop-up menu. In here, I'm going to locate the polysphere and then click that, and that will now take that model and append it to my scene. So now I have two subtools in this file. I have the original blade here that we just created, and then a polysphere model. So now that I have two subtools here, I can now activate Live Boolean. So if I navigate over here to this Live Boolean button, so if I toggle this on over here, this will now enable the Live Boolean preview renderer inside of ZBrush. And what this will allow you to do is it's going to allow you to preview Boolean operations in real time inside of ZBrush. So if I navigate back over here to the subtool palette, you can see on each of the tools here, we have these icons. So the first icon is addition, then we have subtraction, and then we have intersection. Now by activating these icons, this will allow ZBrush to take this polysphere here and then preview it in a live Boolean mode. So currently this is set to addition, so we're not seeing any changes on our screen here. Now if I change the polysphere over here to subtraction, now that polysphere is going to be subtracted from our original mesh. And if I turn off my polyframes here, this should be the result that you will see. Now this is a preview mode of the Boolean. So at this time we can modify any of our shapes and see this update on the fly. So if I select the polysphere here and now still have the Gizmo 3D active, I can come through and start moving this object with the Gizmo 3D, and you're going to see the process of this Boolean take place in real time. So I can start moving this around, and I'm going to see it update in the viewport. Now, in addition to just having this subtraction function, you also have an intersection option. And with the intersection option, it's going to give you the result of where the two pieces intersect. So we have our original blade and our sphere, and if I activate intersection, I'm now going to get this as my result. So you can see it's taking that blade, and I'm only seeing the blade now where that polysphere was. So it's just doing an intersection between those two objects. Now what this is going to allow me to do, I can now manipulate this polysphere, and this is going to give me the result of that intersection. So if I come over here and start scaling this polysphere here, you can see I'm going to start getting this different blade type design. And you can go pretty crazy with this. So I can start scaling this up and down, and you're going to see I'm going to start getting these advanced tapers on my mesh here. So I can keep moving this around and start generating an interesting blade design. Now I can scale or move any way I like on this, and what I'm doing with this process is I'm just manipulating the polysphere. So if I turn on my polyframes here or go into solo mode, you can see this is the model that I am manipulating. So it's that polysphere, and if I come through and start scaling or moving this around, it's going to change how that intersection is happening. So if I disable my polyframes again and then get out of solo, I'm now getting this complex blade shape on my mesh. So I'm just going to tailor this a little bit to get a sharp design here and just move this around and then maybe scale it a little bit here to get this sort of smooth edge on the top of the blade here, maybe thicken it up a little bit. And at this stage you can really just play with the design and get different attributes established. You can also rotate it to get different areas of how this blade is going to function. So I want to make this a little bit of a straight blade, so I'm going to do something like this. And then maybe just expand that out a little bit so I get this a little bit harsher through there. And so now I have something like this. So I have a really sharp edge on the bottom, and I have a not so harsh edge on the top here, and this is going all the way back. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to just change this polysphere a little bit more. So since I'm doing an intersection process, you can see it's getting this round sphere shape towards the back of the blade here. So I want this to be flat. So I'm going to take my polysphere, now activate solo again, and then turn on my polyframes so I can just see the polysphere by itself. And now I want to apply some masking, and I want to take this section of the polysphere and make it square. So I want to just take it and give it a square edge on the back. So now I would just want to mask out half of this sphere. So I'm going to hold down Control, which is going to give me the mask pen. And then I'm just going to drag out a masking box like so, and just come across the center of the sphere here. Now while you're doing this, you can hold down spacebar to move this around. And after I have about half of this knife masked out, I'm just going to release, and now you can see I have masking applied to that part of my model. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to just take this area of the mesh here and scale it. And by scaling it in Z at this stage here, I'm going to take all these vertices and scale them, and that's going to give me a flat surface. So if I come over here and click Scale Z, and then click and drag, you can see as I scale this, it's bringing all those points in. So I'm going to have to do this twice so I get this nice kind of harsh edge here. And then after I have this established, I'm now going to take the Move in Z option here and just click and drag and just move this out. So now I've taken that sphere, I've taken part of it, the unmasked part there, and I've now just scaled it. So now I have a flat edge and then a round edge. Now if I get out of solo and then turn off my polyframes here, you can see now my intersection is generating something like this. So since I've distorted that polysphere, I'm now getting a bladed edge on one side of the knife here, and then a flat edge on the other. Now, since I still have the polysphere masked, I can still manipulate the geometry there. So I can use that Gizmo 3D to make this blade longer or shorter if I desire. So I'm going to make it that length right there. And now I have something like this. So the next thing I want to do is I want to give this a rounded edge here to the back of the blade. So I'm going to append in another shape that's going to allow me to use the Boolean system to generate that result. So I'm going to go back to the subtool palette over here, scroll down to the append option and click this. And then this time I'm going to select the cylinder pipe. So when I click this here, it's now going to append a cylinder pipe object into my scene. And I can come over here and select that cylinder pipe. And now I just want to rotate this with the Gizmo 3D. So I'm going to hover over the Gizmo 3D on the Rotate Z option. I'm going to click and drag, which is going to perform a rotate on the cylinder pipe. And as I reach something like this, I'm going to hold down Shift, and that is now going to lock it into that 90-degree angle. So I want to make sure that cylinder pipe is 90 degrees rotated like this. Now I want to scale it down just a little bit. So I'm going to grab the inner part of the Gizmo 3D here and just click and drag to scale that down. And I want to scale it to about the edge of my knife blade here. So something like this. Now I want to take it and now move it in the x-axis and just position it towards the edge of the blade there. So now I have this shape. So now I can activate the subtraction process on the cylinder pipe, and this will now subtract it from the current result I'm getting with the Boolean system. So the Boolean system will go from top to bottom in your hierarchy list here. So I've taken that blade, I've now appended a polysphere and set it to union mode. So I'm getting the union of the polysphere and the original blade. And now I want to take the cylinder pipe and apply it as a subtractive function. So if I set the subtool for the cylinder pipe to this subtraction option, I'm now getting this result. So now I have that cylinder pipe subtracting from the union result of the top two subtools. So this looks a little bit strange. So I have this disconnect with my blade here. So I only want this part to be happening on the subtraction here. I don't want this part to happen. So I'm just going to go into solo mode and then turn on polyframe so I can see my cylinder pipe shape here. And now I'm just going to modify the design of the cylinder pipe. So I want to just remove the topology that's generating the complete cylinder, and I only want this back part. So when I use this as a subtractive form, it's only going to subtract half of the cylinder pipe. So first I'm going to go back to draw mode here, and now I'm going to use the Control-Shift functionality. So I'm going to hold down Control and Shift. This is going to give me the Select Rectangle brush. I'm going to click and drag this box out. And I just want to engulf about this much of the cylinder here, so I don't want to go across the center line. And I want to hold down the Alt key, which is going to turn the Select Rectangle to red, and then I'm going to release, and that's going to hide half of that cylinder pipe there. So now I should just have this much of the cylinder pipe visible. So now that I have this much visible, I now will just want to delete the hidden areas of that mesh. So I'm going to go back to the tool palette here. I'm going to locate the geometry area, open this up. I'm going to go to Modify Topology, and in here I'm going to perform a Delete Hidden. So this is going to delete any of the non-visible parts of my subtool. I'm just going to click that, and now those faces have been removed. So now I have this hole in my mesh here. Now when you're using the live Boolean system, you have to use meshes that are completely watertight in order to generate true geometry from the Boolean system. So I want to just close the holes on this, which is going to seal these two end caps. So still in the geometry palette here, still in the modify topology area, I'm now going to click close holes. And this is going to look at all the open holes on my model here and now attempt to close them. So clicking this button here will now give me this result. So the next thing I want to do with this cylinder shape is that I want to apply some creasing so I can apply some dynamic subdivisions so I get a really nice clean cut. So I'm going to go back to the dynamic subdivision option here, open this up, and now turn on dynamic. And you can see I'm getting this as a result. So most of this cylinder was already pre-creased. However, the areas that I just performed that close holes function on do not have these edges creased. So I'm getting this kind of weird effect through here. So it's applying smoothing to these areas and not keeping this edge harsh. So I just need to update the creasing quick for this cylinder. So I'm going to go back to the geometry tab in the tool palette. I'm going to go to the crease area here, open this up. And then I'm going to make sure my crease tolerance was set to 45. And now I'm just going to click crease. So that's going to look at the geometry of the model again, and then it's going to apply creasing based on that tolerance. So you can see it applied creasing around this edge here. And now with dynamic subdivision on, I'm now getting this nice clean half cylinder shape. So I'm just going to zoom back out and turn off solo, and then turn off my polyframes, and you can now see I'm getting this result. So I have my knife blade, and then I've now changed that cylinder shape there to get this nice rounded back on the blade. So now I'm just going to append in some more tools to this file and use that subtraction process with the live Boolean to start generating more shapes to the blade here. Thank you for tuning in to part 1 of this tutorial series. Please tune into part 2 as we continue creating the bladed weapon prop.